to engage with Christianity in a sort of very traditionally Žižekian way. And what I'm going to try to do here in the next 10 minutes is explain to you what Žižek means by the perverse core of Christianity and why it's such an interesting argument. Now, one thing that you have to know is that Žižek's argument about Christianity is taken pretty much directly from G.K. Chesterton, a theologian, essayist, and philosopher himself. Now, what Žižek argues can be put in a simple way and in a difficult way. Let me give you the simple way. Žižek's argument about Christianity is that the Christian faith is the only faith in which God has to stop believing in himself. That the key moment in the crucifixion is the moment when Christ says, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" That therefore God's quote-unquote failure to redeem Christ in the moment, or to have Christ prove his prowess as the chosen Son of God, is therefore constitutive or necessary to the emergence of the Trinity. This in and of itself is not a particularly radical argument, and yet the way in which Žižek addresses it has a lot of consequences. For example, Žižek makes the highly provocative argument that maybe the hero of the New Testament, as he puts it, is in fact Judas. That Judas, rather than being the traitor figure who undermines Christ, is the revolutionary agent who allows Christ to take on his full potential. This and more I'm going to try to develop in the following few minutes. Now, to go back to G.K. Chesterton, Chesterton has a really great line about the Christian faith, where he says that it's only in the Christian faith that God is both a rebel and a king. In other words, that in order for Christianity to survive, God had to be an atheist. Now, that's a huge claim. Why would God be an atheist? Again, it goes back to the seeming contradiction within the Christian faith that God had to externalize himself, that God had to, for a moment, stop believing in himself. Now, I'm going to try to explain that step by step. The argument that Chesterton comes up with is he says, why is it, for example, that in the Garden of Eden, there is the tree on which there is the fruit of knowledge? Isn't this an unnecessary temptation? Did God put this temptation there specifically so as to corrupt Adam? Is the very necessity of sin therefore required in order for God to be the arbiter of what is the absolute good? And Chesterton characterizes this as one of the dark cores of Christianity, a seemingly contradictory circumstance within the telling of Christianity. Now, Chesterton's answer to this is, of course, that Adam had to be expelled, that in a sense, the entire edifice of the Garden of Eden was precisely so as to create the necessity of sin in order for there to be good. That Adam's fall was thereby less a fall from grace, but instead the emergence of an other to God himself, namely man in the world who could worship God. Now, the more radical conclusion from this is that God has to externalize himself, that God, the eternal deity, has to become finite in man in order to be complete. That, in a sense, without the Christian revolution, namely that of the Trinity, there would be no God as such. Žižek takes this idea of what Chesterton deems the dark core of Christianity, namely the fact that God is incomplete, that God is ontologically void, that the gap between God and man has to be transposed back into man himself. Žižek takes this idea and suggests that we reread or reconsider the betrayal of Judas. Essentially, Žižek says that every leader, in order to be truly successful, has to be betrayed. That at some point, there has to be a moment in which the leader, in fact, encourages betrayal. That what happens within Judas's betrayal is that he gives up on Christ in order to promote the cause of Christ. That without Christ's arrest and subsequent death and crucifixion and resurrection, there would be no Christian universal church as we know it today. Therefore, Žižek argues that we might even suggest or go as far as to say that Christ wanted to be betrayed by Judas. Now, this is where Žižek has a distinction. He says there's two ways at looking at this scene. Either the vulgar reading, as he puts it, is that Christ signals between the lines that he wants Judas to betray him. But the less vulgar, more interesting reading, according to Žižek, is to say, what if it was Judas who realized that his betrayal was necessary in order for Christ not only to die, but for the revolution of Christ to live on? That Christ becomes not just a martyr figure, but that the necessary demise of Christ was precisely the constitutive event within what would become the Christian faith. And that in this sense, Judas's betrayal is in fact a form of sacrifice, namely that his name will forever be associated with being that of the traitor Judas. Now, this is where Žižek pivots actually to Paul. Žižek says that, what if Paul, the external figure, the non-acolyte, the non-apostle, was therefore precisely the one who had to step into the void, the gap left by Judas at the table, to therefore institutionalize the Christian event of the crucifixion, which was therefore initiated by Judas, into the church. And therefore, that Judas becomes the vanishing mediator between the particular figure of Christ and the universal emergence of the church. And that Paul is therefore, for Žižek, a Leninist-type figure who was less interested in the historical figure of Jesus and more interested in the organizing of the quote-unquote party, or the beginnings of the church, after Christ's death. Žižek's argument is therefore that the perverse core of Christianity is that, in a sense, Christ had to be betrayed. In fact, that Christ perhaps wanted to be betrayed, and that the ultimate figure of the traitor, namely Judas, was therefore acting not on a malign level of individual profit, but instead was the true believer in the cause, the one who was willing to sacrifice his immortal name in order to promote the Christian faith. Now, this is kind of a mind-blowing analysis. It's highly provocative, right? To argue that it is, in fact, Judas who is the key constituent element within the unfolding of the faith. And yet it links back to Chesterton's argument. Chesterton has an interesting argument about God where he says that the ultimate form of love is not to aspire towards the infinite, that two people meet and they see in each other reflected the eternity of their love, but instead that the ultimate act of love is precisely to relinquish eternity on behalf of the particular. Think about how in Tolkien, Arwen is ready to give up her eternal elvish identity in order to be with Aragorn. Here we see, of course, how the seemingly pagan fantasy of Tolkien is precisely entirely Christian. And Chesterton makes the argument, therefore, that this is exactly what God does. That in the manner in which Arwen gives up her eternal identity for the love of Aragorn, God gives up his eternal identity for the love of man. Hence, what Žižek argues, therefore, is that the historical necessity of Christ's failure is therefore the necessary determinant by which this transposition of God's eternal essence into the singular come universal of man unfolds. And that therefore Judas is the key figure, the hero within the entire unfolding of the Passion. Now, I want to add here one more thing, which is that when Žižek talks about the perverse core of Christianity, we have to understand his definition of perverse, which he takes from Lacanian Freudian psychoanalysis. The idea of perversion for Freud isn't simply a non-heteronormative sexual practice. Instead, on a structural level, the idea of perversion is the seeming exception that proves the rule. Now, Judas is, of course, the seeming exception, the traitor, the one who betrays Christ. And yet precisely in this betrayal, he secures the continuation of the Christian lineage through the death and resurrection of Christ. Hence, Žižek's argument is that the perverse core of Christianity is that the event that appears to be entirely antithetical to the Christian faith, namely Judas's betrayal, his famous kiss, is in fact not an act of hatred, but the singular act of love by which he betrays the singular historic figure of Christ on behalf of the continuation of the crucifixion and the revolution of the Christian faith, which is to come. That is Žižek's argument about the perverse core of Christianity and how it relates to G.K. Chesterton's argument that God had to be an atheist. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you'd like to download these masterclasses and all of my lectures as audio files, plus access my...
So this is about Walter Benjamin and his theory of new media. Specifically, I want to talk about his classic essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, or as it is titled in the original German, Das Kunstwerk im Zeitalter seiner technischen Reproduzierbarkeit. It was written in 1935 in Paris, so that's nearly 90 years ago. And it's a path-breaking and highly influential essay. And if not the first, then at least one of the first theories of new media. I'm specifically interested in it because I think it's probably even more relevant today than almost a century ago. And moreover, I think the ideas that Benjamin expresses there are also more obvious today than they were in the 1930s. The essay can rightly be called an avant-gardist essay, and it can be called avant-gardist for 4 reasons. Number one, it moves on from the traditional aesthetic focus on fine arts. It's not about painting or sculpture primarily, but its main interest lies in the new media arts of photography and film. So it's in effect about new media. Then secondly, and I quote here, Benjamin wants to brush aside a number of outmoded concepts, such as creativity and genius, eternal value, and mystery. So here he very radically abolishes the traditional, what we could call idealist focus on beauty, or an elitist focus on genius, or a religious or pseudo-religious focus on eternal value. Now, then thirdly, while abolishing this traditional idealist framework, he integrates aesthetics and media theory into socio-political theory. And that's avant-gardist too. Now, fourth, more specifically, Benjamin writes that he's interested in the, quote again, developmental tendencies of art under present conditions of production. So that's not just a materialist approach, but more specifically, actually a Marxist approach by looking at present conditions of production. And by applying these present conditions of production, including whatever present conditions of technology, to art. Now, importantly, unlike a crude so-called cultural Marxism, as we find it some way nowadays, Benjamin is not interested in anything like identity politics, and specifically not in any simplistic oppressor-oppressed binary. Instead, he critically, again in his own words, assesses the revolutionary demands in the politics of art. That is, he presents a very complex analysis of numerous contradictions that arise in the context of new forms of producing art. Number one, with technological means. Number two, as we will see, in the context of a mass audience and of mass production. So again, rather than coming up with any simplistic, moralistic demands, he's interested in a thorough analysis of, for instance, the contradictions and the problems, but also in the political possibilities arising out of this. So why in the 1930s is Benjamin interested in arts and politics? Well, very simply put, because art has changed from being an art for and by the elites to art for and by the masses. This is obvious in 3 competitive political frameworks at the time. Number one, capitalism, whatever. In England, in the USA, the movie industry is marketing, is commodifying art and making a mass product out of it. Secondly, in Germany, and that's obviously Benjamin's background, he was actually fleeing the Nazis already at that time. The Nazis had taken power in 1933. Fascism also uses art in order to manipulate the masses, in order to enrage the masses, in order to entertain the masses, in order to mobilize the masses. And then thirdly, also in communist Russia, in the Soviet Union, which had been established for nearly 20 years at the time when the essay was written, or 18 years. Also, art is being revolutionized, and the idea is that a new communist art of the masses can be an essential element of the new communist society. So Benjamin's analysis of art is very much based, number one, on trying to understand how it is being commodified in capitalism. It's based on Benjamin's fear of how art might be utilized in fascism. And it's also based on a certain hope of what art can be in communism. A hope, by the way, I should add, that remained clearly unfulfilled. Benjamin's focus is on art under conditions of technological reproduction. And therefore, his focus shifts from the traditional fine arts to film and photography. A key theoretical insight by Benjamin is that this switch to mechanically reproduced art moves art out of the sphere of authenticity. So with this switch, actually Benjamin foreshadows a number of later developments in 20th century media theory. By focusing on art in the new media, somehow Benjamin already connects with McLuhan's later very basic insight, the medium is the message. He shifts very much to an analysis of the medium as such. Then secondly, he also becomes very much aware that art is now, even without using this term, a spectacle, as De Boer will later say. And then thirdly, he also very much expresses an awareness of art in media being used for simulating a sort of hyper-reality in Baudrillard's terms. And finally, we can also see how art is used in the service of branding, of profile creation. And I will point to all these four aspects while taking a closer look at the essay itself. Benjamin very accurately notices that the rise of the new media brings about a certain, as he calls it, loss of aura and an end of authenticity. Let's see what he writes. He says, "The here and now of the original defines the concept of authenticity. The whole sphere of authenticity is outside of technical, and of course not only technical, reproducibility." And then he says, from a photographic negative, for example, one can make any number of prints. To ask for the authentic print makes no sense. So very clearly, photography and film are example of an art of simulacra, as Baudrillard will later say. Artworks are copies without originals. Therefore, a core aspect that characterized the work of art is lost, namely the authentic substantiality of the work of art. And Benjamin clearly says that one might subsume the eliminated element in the term aura. So clearly, traditional, religious icons or portraits, paintings of aristocrats are now being replaced, for instance, by photographs or by movies. Importantly, for Benjamin, this is not necessarily a bad thing. There is no authenticity nostalgia in Benjamin. Instead, he views the loss of the aura as a sort of catharsis. He writes that in contemporary mass movements, their most powerful agent is the film. And its social significance, he says, is inconceivable without its cathartic aspect, that is, the liquidation of the traditional value of the cultural heritage. So for him, the loss of aura, the loss of authenticity, is cathartic in the sense that it liberates and democratizes art. it takes art out of the hands of the elites and makes it accessible to the people, to the masses. And again, for him, that's a cathartic effect. This cathartic or emancipatory effect also takes art out of the sphere of religion, out of the sphere of ritual. Benjamin writes, "For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. In film and photography," he says, "the criterion of authenticity ceases to be applicable to artistic production. The total social function of art is reversed. Instead of being based on ritual, it is based on another practice, politics." So by emancipating art from religion, from the aristocracy, from the elites, and thereby from authenticity, art becomes political by and for everyone. In the course of this liberation and of this cathartic emancipation and of this loss of the aura and the overcoming of authenticity, Benjamin compares what he calls two polar types, two different kinds of art value. The traditional one he calls cult value, and the new one he calls exhibition value. He writes, "In prehistoric times, art, by the absolute emphasis on its cult value, was first and foremost an instrument of magic. Today, by the absolute emphasis on its exhibition value, the work of art becomes a creation with entirely new functions, as exemplified by photography and film." So here is a very clear polarization. Cult value, traditional art, versus exhibition value. Focus on ritual in traditional art, whereas a focus on politics in contemporary art. An elitist art versus an art often by the people. And a replacement of, let's say, authenticity value with reproduction value. In line with what Benjamin writes in his essay, I want to really focus on this notion of exhibition value. And I want to discuss it by identifying 5 core characteristics of exhibition value. Number 1, it is related to a critical but distant mass audience. Number 2, in the context of exhibition value, art is characterized by mass participation and what I'd like to call mundanization. Number 3, along with exhibition value, what happens is a sort of self-exhibition to an intangible market. Number 4, we see an emerging celebrity cult. Some sort of self-branding arises, and along with it, exhibition anxiety is on the rise too. And number 5, art now becomes a mass-conditioned, critical fun experience. Let's talk about these things in a little more detail. So first, about the critical but distant mass audience. Benjamin writes, "The audience takes the position of a reviewer," the German word is Begutachter, you can also translate it with critic, "who is unimpeded by any personal contact with the performer. The audience only empathizes with the performer by empathizing with the camera." So obviously he talks here about watching a movie and filming a movie. What the technology does here, it interferes compared with traditional theater performance. It mediates between the performers and the audience, and therefore it somehow depersonalizes the contact between the audience and the performer. It kind of makes the performance more of a virtual performance, because again, the performance is not an original performance, but a mechanically reproduced performance. The technology is intersected in between the performer and the audience, and thereby there is no personal presence of the performer to the audience or vice versa. And then Benjamin also says, it is inherent in the technique of the film as well as that of sports that everybody who witnesses the displayed accomplishments is somewhat of an expert. So While on the one hand, there is now this kind of virtual distance between the performer and the audience is also somehow empowered. It becomes more critical, like the audience that watches a sports performance where everyone can have an opinion, everyone is entitled to having a view. So somehow, by being exposed to a mass audience rather than to a small, immediate elite audience, the distinction between the expert audience and the layman audience is erased. Everyone is now part of the audience, and everyone now can be somehow a critic. Unlike with watching a traditional highbrow theater performance, when a mass audience watches a popular movie, everyone can have their say. So this directly leads to the second point, mass participation and mundanization. Benjamin writes, with the increasing extension of the press, an increasing number of readers became writers. The distinction between author and public is about to lose its foundational meaning. So clearly, the distinction between producer and consumer is increasingly erased. Benjamin says, the newsreel offers everyone the opportunity to rise from passerby to movie extra. In this way, anyone might even find themselves part of a work of art, right? We have these movies which are not only watched by the masses, but where also the masses perform. And instead of just having a few actors, now major movie productions have thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of extras and thereby of actors. Everyone can participate. Art becomes much more participatory. The distinction between performer and the audience is challenged by audience and participants, so to speak, increasingly changing their roles in a dynamic way. Benjamin also observes, with regard to communist cinema of the Soviet Union, he says, some of the players who we meet in Russian films are not actors in our sense, but people who portray themselves, and primarily in their own work process. So referring, for instance, here to socialist realist movies. So the profane, the common, the mundane activity becomes increasingly the main theme of artistic reproduction. Everyday life is now presented in the context of new media artworks. In connection with this, presentation becomes a form of self-exhibition to an intangible market. Benjamin writes, in film, what matters is not so much that the actor performs someone else before a live audience, but much more that he or she performs him or herself before the camera. And he adds, never for a moment do the screen actors cease to be conscious of this fact. They face the public, the consumers who constitute the market. This market where they offer not only their labor, but also their whole self, heart, and soul is intangible. So in movies, what Benjamin says, instead of whatever playing King Lear, actors perform as actors themselves. Somehow a Johnny Depp in a movie represents first and foremost the actor Johnny Depp. They constantly exhibit themselves and are hoping for validation from the anonymous masses. They exhibit themselves, their own, as Benjamin says, self, heart, and soul, to an anonymous mass audience. This clearly leads, fourthly, to a celebrity cult, self-branding, and, as Benjamin diagnoses it, a form of exhibition anxiety. He says that a sort of new anxiety grips the actor before the camera. And he continues by saying the film responds to the shriveling of the aura with an artificial buildup of a personality outside the studio. The celebrity cult, fostered by the money of the film industry, preserves only that part of the magic of personal identity, Zauber der Persönlichkeit in German, which consists in the hocus pocus, fauler Zauber in German, of its commodification, its Warencharakter. So the film industry, as we can say today, brands actors as celebrities in order to market them to a mass audience, to sell them basically as a commodity. And the actors participate in this in a process of self-commodification and self-branding. And that, Benjamin says, produces a new anxiety, an anxiety of maybe not succeeding, maybe not being able to sell oneself well. Instead of the traditional aura of the artwork and the artist, which was somehow magical, now again Benjamin says we have the hocus pocus, the fake magic that is produced in the context of marketing. Importantly, this model of the celebrity now becomes common, it becomes universal. Everyone can somehow be an artist, and everyone is somehow a critic. So everyone can relate to themselves and to others in the mode of the celebrity. The fifth and last characteristic Benjamin mentions in relation to exhibition value is what I would call a mass-conditioned critical fun experience. And I think that's a very interesting observation by Benjamin. Again, he writes, mechanical reproduction of art changes the reaction of the masses toward art. The reactionary attitude toward a Picasso painting changes into the progressive reaction toward a Chaplin movie. The progressive reaction is characterized by the fusion of the fun of watching and experiencing with the attitude of the expert critic. In the movie theater, the critical and the fun-loving attitudes of the audience coincide. So we're not just critics, at the same time, we're also customers who want to be entertained. So this fusion of the critic and the customer who wants to be entertained produces an interesting behavioral and psychological effect. Benjamin writes, the decisive factor is, in the movie theater, the individual reactions that taken together constitute the mass reaction of the audience are conditioned in advance by the massification in which they immediately result. What Benjamin describes here are very common mass reactions, let's say in a movie theater, where a lot of people laugh at the same time. Basically, everyone laughs at the same time. And he says that this mass laughter is an effect of everyone basically anticipating that this is the time to laugh. So you anticipate the mass reaction and then produce this very mass reaction. It's similar, whatever, to a comedian coming on stage, whatever, a stand-up comedian, right? And the stand-up comedian hasn't really said anything, and already the audience laughs. So basically, everyone laughs because everyone expects everyone else to be laughing, or everyone applauds because everyone expects everyone else to be applauding. Or maybe even everyone is offended because everyone expects everyone else to be offended. I would call this a kind of a shift from awe to awesome. The traditional artwork in the context of cult value was received with awe, and you would basically be speechless in front of it. Now, the mass audience finds things awesome and expresses this, for instance, in laughter or in applause. That is produced in the context of a rather complex psychological and behavioral mass phenomenon, having to do with exhibition and exhibition value, and reflecting the fusion of the critical audience and the fun-loving customer. So in 1935, Benjamin was outlining that exhibition value characterizes new media art. I think now in 2022, it's very obvious that precisely these characteristics also apply to contemporary social media and probably apply in a much larger scale. Number one, on this YouTube channel, we have a critical but distant mass audience. Number two, there is mass participation. Everyone can comment, everyone can show themselves, everyone can film themselves. And this happens at the same time as a form of mundanization. You go to a restaurant and then you post a picture of your dinner on social media. As Benjamin says importantly, everyone today can lay claim to being filmed. And not only can everyone lay claim to being filmed, everyone can film themselves. So number three, there is also a mass self-exhibition to an intangible market going on social media. That's what social media is for. They provide the forum for self-exhibition to an intangible market. And of course now the celebrity cult number four has become ubiquitous. Self-branding and exhibition anxiety are part of almost everyone's life nowadays. And number five, clearly we have mass-conditioned critical fun experience whenever watching a movie, going to a show, or for that matter, watching comedy. Towards the end of his essay, Benjamin formulates two worries. The first one is a worry about diversion, Zerstreuung, as he says. He writes, "The greatly increased mass of participants has produced a change in the mode of participation in art. Art will tackle the most difficult and most important tasks where it is able to mobilize the masses. The public is an examiner, but a diverted one." The word diversion has basically two meanings. It can mean entertained, but it can also mean to be distracted. And the German word Zerstreuung has the same double meaning. The first worry that Benjamin expresses here is that instead of bringing about an actual mobilization of the masses, instead of making the masses politically active and allowing them to express themselves, it may simply divert them. On the one hand, entertain them, but on the other hand, also distract them from taking political action. This very fear that in the context of capitalist commodification of mass art, in, again, film and photography, art will become mostly a tool of diversion, has been expressed by other major media theorists later on. For instance, when Adorno and Horkheimer write about the dialectics of the Enlightenment and specifically about the cultural industry, they make a very similar point as well. And then again, a little bit later, we have Neil Postman writing the famous book about amusing ourselves to death. So these are all observations in line with Benjamin's observation that new media art can function as a tool of diversion rather than a tool of mobilization. This brings us to the second worry by Benjamin, namely that fascism abuses art for its own purposes. Of course, the essay was written when fascism and communism clashed violently. From the perspective of communism, art can be used to mobilize the masses. And in Benjamin's terms, communism therefore stands for politicizing art. To the contrary, Benjamin is afraid, fascism uses art to aestheticize politics and thereby to delude the masses. He writes, "Fascism desires to give the masses a chance to express themselves. Humankind's self-alienation has reached such a degree that it experiences its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. This is the aestheticization of politics that fascism engages in." So fascism basically uses art, for instance in film, but also with mass events in order to delude the masses and to fanatize the masses, to create a sort of fanatic, orgiastic spectacle of self-destruction and a celebration of violence. So Benjamin worried if communism can respond to this by politicizing art. Can communism succeed in making art, film, photography, a means of free and creative mass self-expression? I think it's fair to say that communism did not succeed in this endeavor. Looking back on Benjamin's theory from a contemporary perspective, we can probably say that the new media were neither bringing about a communist utopia, and also the fascist appropriation of art has had its time, and although it's been catastrophic, it's a thing of history. Instead, today, new media and within new media art often serves what I would call the age of prophylicity. It enables profile curation, both on an individual level as well as on a collective level. It is addressed to a general peer, and it enables social validation feedback loops. On the social media market, we mutually curate, speaking with Benjamin, not only our labor, but also our whole self, our heart and soul. So it seems quite obvious that today art neither functions in the context of communism nor of fascism, but in most cases in the context of capitalism. It seems that Benjamin was very correct in pointing out that the emergence of this new kind of art signals the end of the age of authenticity. It seems clear to me that we've moved on from the age of authenticity to an age of prophylicity. And I think that Benjamin's analysis of the politics and the psychology of photography and film in the 1930s is actually an early description of this transition from authenticity to prophylicity. And the shift from cult value to exhibition value that he described is central to this shift. Exhibition value has become a central concern, not just in art, but in producing and marketing in the economy, and importantly also in creating one's notion of personal identity, of who oneself is,